Buen Camino, everybody. I'm back today with another book review, and this one is actually going to be the first book that I read this year. It's not directly Camino related, but it is related to the history of Spain, so thus it's indirectly Camino related. And it is Arthur Koestler's Dialogue with Death. It is the journal of a prisoner of the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. So once again, this is going back to my enduring interest in the Spanish Civil War period, which I was interested in before I started studying the Camino or any of that. And Arthur Koestler, I've read several of his books. One is Darkness at Noon is like his most popular book. This book is actually very similar to Darkness at Noon, but Darkness at Noon is the story of kind of a communist true believer who is then imprisoned in like a Stalinist system instead of in a fascist system in the Soviet Union instead of in Spain. But I think that there's some very similar experiences. The difference mainly being that Darkness at Noon is a novel that was written later and was kind of very controversial because it came out at a time before a lot of people in the Communist Party were denouncing Stalin. It came out at a time when all the negative things about Stalin weren't known or weren't admitted to by a lot of the people on the left, and Arthur Koestler was definitely considered one of those people who, left the Communist Party, became disillusioned by Stalinism. At the time that he wrote Dialogue with Death, he was still very much like a party member. It wasn't kind of known at the time that the things that he was being accused of when he was arrested by the fascists, some of them were actually true. That's the other main difference, is that Dialogue with Death is a memoir. So Dialogue with Death is nonfiction. This really happened to Arthur Koestler, and then he kind of used some of the experience of being in prison and waiting execution to inform Darkness at Noon. And I would say probably the next most famous work of his is his section of a book called The God That Failed, which is written entirely by people like him who had become disillusioned with communism and who left, I think, in the 30s to like 50s time period. It might even end in the 1940s, but that book I read part of in maybe an undergraduate, and I think we did read Arthur Koestler's section of The God That Failed. I'm not sure what chapters we read of it, and that book is actually a little bit harder to get a hold of for being a very famous book. Probably any library you go to would get it, but getting a new copy is like $40 for some reason, and there's not seemingly a lot of used copies around that are cheaply available. This book is in print. Darkness at Noon is in print, and Arthur Koestler wrote a ton more later on in his life, and his opinions varied throughout his life drastically. So if you read something of his from the 30s versus the 40s versus the 70s, it's going to be totally different. He was kind of like me a little bit. He's probably against whatever anybody's for. He just is a contrarian who assumes new philosophies all the time, but always thinks that he has the moral high ground. It's over, everyone. I have the high ground. At least that's my interpretation of him. As far as this book goes, it was a pretty quick read. I believe that I started it before January 1st, so this might technically be the last book of 2019 that I read. In my notes, it says January 1st, but in my recollection, I think it was sometime after Christmas. But at any rate, I didn't get too far, and then it was actually like January 1st and 2nd that I read this book. So it's been a couple months, so I want to review this now because I want to review everything that I read this year. If you've read other books of the Spanish Civil War, this one is very different because it doesn't deal a lot with the setup and the political nature of the war. It really is just capturing his experience as a prisoner of the fascists. When it was initially published, there was another part of the book. It was like a testament of Spain. And that part, he said, was pure propaganda, and that described the time period leading up to his imprisonment. And he basically exercised that part from the book later on because it was, I think, printed at the bequest of someone in the Communist Party. That part he wanted never to be in print again. His Spanish Testament part of the book, he wanted never to be published again. He just wanted the second half of the book, Dialogue of Death, to be in print, and I think it's been in print ever since. It's a very powerful and moving book. It describes about 3 or 4 months, I think, of his imprisonment, and the entire time he thinks that he's going to be executed. He's first incommunicato, which is like solitary confinement. He can't write to a lawyer, his wife, the consulate, an ambassador, his family, anybody. There's no contact. I mean, we're not talking about phone calls here. There's no letters. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He doesn't know if there's going to be a trial. He thinks that there's probably going to be something like a show trial, because he was a journalist who was then arrested. And he was arrested probably well after he should have fled the area that he was in. He probably should have gotten out, and that part is described in the book, the kind of final days. And if you read some of the other books that I've read recently, like Hotel Florida and everything, he's definitely like a side character in those books. People knew him. People knew of his journalistic work. And if you read like Hotel Florida or some of those other books, you can see the interactions between characters. He knew certain of the photographers and everything that were working in that. He knew people that were in Madrid and Barcelona, and his case became a kind of celebrated case because he was an English journalist, or he had an English passport at that time, I believe, and kind of raised an uproar against Franco in certain sectors because, you know, it wasn't out that he actually was doing Communist Party business, which was what he was arrested for. I don't think that should take away from the work, though, because it really, the majority of it is not a political work. It's more a work of describing his life in this prison and on death row. And it's a very powerful, very moving book. There's definitely a lot of overlap with Darkness at Noon, and you can definitely see how that informed his later work. And with that, it kind of is interesting because one is describing a communist prison system, the other is describing a fascist prison system, and the overlap is so transparent and so complete that it's like, well, you know, if you've been on trial, on death row, in one totalitarian system, you know, you've been in prison in all of the totalitarian systems, because as totalitarian systems, if you buy into that whole totalitarian system theory, they're kind of, the ideology is interchangeable in some ways with the function of the state and of the party. I guess the one difference you can say is that in some ways he's like a prisoner of war, but he's not, because he's not a combatant. And I think that is what led, I think, to the general uproar from the international community, which does, in fact, lead him to be freed. He doesn't even know that he's going to be freed like a day or two before it happens. It just kind of gets sprung on him like everything else. He does eventually have some contact with the consulate. But it's a deeply philosophical book in that the entire existence that he's describing is a kind of nihilistic existence on the brink. And that appealed to me too. So I liked the first person perspective of this. I liked the non-novelistic approach. I liked the very bare and sparse way that he was just dealing with the most existential of matters. And I think that there's probably not a lot of people who have gone from day to day to day for months in prison expecting to be executed at any moment, having people around them executed, and then lived to tell this tale and done it with kind of the philosophy and insight that Arthur Koestler had. So I highly recommend this book for anyone that's interested in totalitarianism, in fascism, in 20th century Spain, in communism, even because the relevance of his later works about communism and how it's informed by this book, even though it's an experience in a fascist prison. I think that that makes it, if you've read Darkness at Noon or The God That Fails, or if you're interested in that, or if you're studying 20th century Europe, I would actually teach a class with this book. It's a pretty short read. It's very heavy material, but it's like 215 pages with the epilogue and the preface and everything in here. It was dirt cheap. I don't remember why I got it. I think I was just like, well, I'm getting all these books on the Spanish Civil War, and they were like, well, you've read this guy before. Here's a book that he wrote about the Spanish Civil War. And I was like, bing, check, I did it. But yeah, this one I can highly recommend. It's very readable. It's very moving. It's very powerful. And it's very unique in kind of a perspective of an aspect of the human situation, the human condition, that is rarely written about in this way. It's almost like a Holocaust memoir, like a Holocaust survivor memoir. So what more can you say about literature other than it has a unique insight into a key part of the human condition? I mean, I'm not sure what higher praise you could give something. So Arthur Koestler's Dialogue with Death, first book of 2020. Third book I have reviewed. I think I've got like 4 more to go through, but here's number 1. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. I will have some more blogs coming up soon, but I'm going to actually just film another book review after this. So, buen camino. Until the next time, guys.